Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales that inspire hope, resilience, and the power of community. Today, we share the heartfelt journey of MIA, a young girl who, despite overwhelming challenges, finds strength through love, determination, and the unwavering support of those around her. Her story reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can spark profound change. Stay with us as we delve into this moving narrative of courage and compassion. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories to join us in celebrating extraordinary stories of the human spirit. Let's begin today's story. The morning sun poured over the sleepy streets of Meadow Creek, illuminating neat rows of modest homes with their freshly painted fences and well-tended lawns. It was one of those rare summer days when everything felt just right, the soft warmth of the sun, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the comforting hum of a neighborhood waking up. On her small front lawn, MIA stood proudly beside a foldable table that she and her grandmother, Mrs. Betty, had set up together. The air smelled of freshly baked cookies, warm muffins, and the faint tang of lemonade. A banner, hand-drawn with crayon, fluttered gently in the breeze, fresh bakes for a better tomorrow. MIA was only 10, but she carried herself with the determination of someone far older. Her dark, curly hair was pulled into two tight braids, and her face shone with the kind of optimism that only childhood can hold. Next to her, Mrs. Betty carefully placed a tray of chocolate chip cookies on the table. Her hands were slow and deliberate, each movement revealing the toll of age and illness. Despite her frailty, there was a quiet strength in Mrs. Betty, a kind of grace that made her the pillar of Mia's world. "Everything looks perfect, Grandma," MIA beamed, adjusting a plate of muffins. "We're going to sell out so fast." Mrs. Betty smiled warmly, her weathered face glowing with pride. "You've outdone yourself, MIA. These treats are going to make everyone's day." Her voice carried the softness of someone who had spent a lifetime nurturing others, though now it was tinged with weariness. The bake sale wasn't just a fun summer project for MIA, it was a mission. Mrs. Betty's medical bills had been piling up, and MIA had overheard more than one worried conversation about how they would manage. Determined to help, MIA had spent weeks planning the sale, testing recipes, and carefully writing out the banner that now flapped in the breeze. As the morning went on, neighbors stopped by, drawn by the scent of warm pastries and the sight of Mia's infectious smile. Mr. Thompson from down the street bought a dozen cookies for his grandchildren, slipping an extra $20 bill into the jar. A jogger paused to buy a muffin, her expression softening as she read the banner. Each small act of kindness filled MIA with hope. By mid-morning, the jar was already heavy with bills and coins. "We've made $50 already, Grandma," MIA exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. "That's almost enough for one of your prescriptions." Mrs. Betty reached over and squeezed Mia's hand gently. "You're incredible, MIA. I don't know what I'd do without you." The two shared a moment of quiet pride, their bond as unshakable as the roots of an old oak tree. But just as the sun reached its zenith and the neighborhood quieted, the warm, hopeful atmosphere shifted. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its black and white exterior gleaming in the sunlight. It stopped abruptly in front of their house, and 3 officers stepped out. Leading them was Officer Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. His eyes were hard and his lips pulled into a tight line, as though he'd already decided he was about to teach someone a lesson. Mia's smile faltered, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are the police here?" Mrs. Betty straightened, leaning on her cane for support. Her calm demeanor masked the unease creeping into her heart. "Stay close to me, MIA," she murmured. Officer Carter approached the table, his gaze sweeping over the baked goods and the banner with barely concealed disdain. "Afternoon," he said curtly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "We've received complaints about an unauthorized business being run here. Do you have a permit for this bake sale? Mrs. Betty tilted her head slightly, her tone calm but firm. Officer, this is just a small bake sale. We're not running a business. My granddaughter and I are just trying to raise a little money to help with my medical bills. Carter's expression hardened. Doesn't matter, he said, crossing his arms. You're operating without a permit. And that's a violation of city ordinances. Shut it down. But we're not doing anything wrong, MIA burst out. Her voice tinged with disbelief. We're just selling cookies. Everyone loves them. Mrs. Betty placed a steadying hand on Mia's shoulder. Officer, surely this is just a misunderstanding, she said patiently. We're not disturbing anyone. Can't we work this out? Carter's lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Rules are rules, he said. Pack it up now. Or we'll have to take action. The words hung in the air, cold and unyielding. Mrs. Betty opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, Carter nodded to one of his team members. Confiscate the money and break down the setup. No, MIA shouted, stepping in front of the table as the officers advanced. You can't do this. Carter's gaze bore into her, his tone sharp. Step aside. Kid. Mrs. Betty moved to shield MIA, her frail frame trembling. Leave her alone, she cried, her voice cracking. But Carter shoved her aside, his hand rough and dismissive. Mrs. Betty stumbled backward, her cane clattering to the ground as she fell to the pavement. Grandma, MIA screamed, rushing to her side. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside her, clutching her hand. Are you okay? Please. Say something. Mrs. Betty groaned softly, clutching her side. The world seemed to close in around MIA as the officers continued their destruction, overturning the table and scattering the baked goods. The jar of money was seized, its contents spilling onto the pavement like shattered dreams. The scene drew the attention of neighbors, who gathered at a distance, their expressions a mixture of shock and anger. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others murmured in disbelief. Finally, as the officers drove away, leaving chaos in their wake, the street fell eerily silent. Mr. Thompson approached slowly, his face lined with anger and sorrow. They had no right to do that, he said, his voice heavy. I'll call the city council. This can't go unanswered. MIA knelt in the wreckage of their bake sale, her small hands trembling as she tried to gather the scattered remains. Her heart burned with a mixture of grief and determination. We'll try again. Grandma, she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. We won't give up. Mrs. Betty placed a trembling hand on Mia's cheek, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. I know you won't. Sweetheart, she said softly. I know you won't. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the quiet street. MIA helped Mrs. Betty to a nearby bench, her small hands steadying her grandmother's frail frame. The older woman winced as she sat, her breath shallow and uneven. Grandma, we should go to the hospital, MIA said softly, her voice thick with worry. Mrs. Betty shook her head weakly. I'll be fine. Baby, she whispered, her tone trying to reassure. Just let me catch my breath. MIA bit her lip, glancing at the wreckage of their bake sale, crumbs scattered on the pavement, the banner torn and fluttering in the breeze. Her heart ached, and tears threatened to spill again. But she fought them back. Her grandmother needed her to be strong. Just as MIA turned to pick up the broken pieces, the rumble of a sleek black SUV filled the air. It pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows gleaming under the fading sunlight. MIA barely noticed as the door opened, and a tall, elegant woman stepped out, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement. Her face was composed, yet her sharp eyes quickly took in the chaos before her, the overturned table, the broken plates, and the trembling pair on the bench. Excuse me, the woman said gently, her voice warm but commanding. She crouched to meet Mia's tear-streaked face. Are you two all right? What happened here? MIA hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Betty. Her grandmother gave a small nod. Too weak to speak. Gathering her courage, MIA turned back to the woman. The police came, she said, her voice trembling. They said we needed a permit for our bake sale. They pushed my grandma and took all the money we raised for her medical bills. The woman's brows furrowed, and her jaw tightened as Mia's words sank in. They took your money? She asked, disbelief and anger creeping into her tone. MIA nodded, her small fists clenching. It wasn't fair. We weren't doing anything wrong. They just destroyed everything. The woman glanced at Mrs. Betty, noticing her wincing as she rubbed her shoulder. And they hurt you? She asked, her voice sharp now, though her eyes remained soft. It's nothing, Mrs. Betty said faintly. I'm more worried about MIA. She worked so hard to set this up. The woman straightened, her expression hardening. No one should have to go through this, especially not a child trying to help her grandmother. She sat beside Mrs. Betty on the bench, listening intently as MIA recounted every detail. As the story unfolded, the woman's calm exterior belied the fire burning beneath the surface. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but resolute. This isn't right. They had no right to treat you like this. Turning to MIA, she added, what's your name, sweetheart? MIA, the girl replied hesitantly. Well, MIA. My name is Evelyn. And I'm going to help you. Here's what we'll do. First, we'll get your grandma to a doctor to make sure she's okay. Then, we'll figure out how to replace the money those officers took. And after that, Evelyn's eyes gleamed with determination. We'll make sure everyone knows what happened here. Mia's tears began to dry as she looked up at Evelyn. You'll help us? She asked, her voice tinged with a cautious hope. Evelyn crouched down again, placing a hand on Mia's shoulder. Absolutely. What they did to you was wrong. And I won't let them get away with it. But first, let's make sure your grandma gets the care she needs. Mrs. Betty opened her mouth to protest, but Evelyn silenced her with a kind smile. No arguments. Let me take care of this. Evelyn pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, another sleek SUV pulled up, driven by one of her assistants. Carefully, she helped Mrs. Betty into the back seat, ensuring she was comfortable before turning to MIA. Let's go. MIA. We have a lot to do. The ride to the clinic was quiet. MIA sat close to her grandmother, clutching her hand tightly, while Evelyn spoke softly to her assistant about arranging further help. When they arrived, a kind-hearted doctor named Dr. Ramirez took over, examining Mrs. Betty with the utmost care. She's fragile, but there's no major damage, Dr. Ramirez explained to Evelyn after the examination. However, her health is delicate. She needs to avoid stress and stay on top of her treatments. Evelyn nodded, her resolve hardening. Thank you, doctor. We'll make sure she gets what she needs. MIA felt a flicker of relief but still couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. As they left the clinic and drove toward the police station, she clung tightly to Evelyn's promise of justice. The police station loomed ahead, its brick facade cold and unyielding under the evening sky. Evelyn parked the SUV and stepped out with the quiet authority of someone used to commanding attention. She opened the door for Mrs. Betty, offering her arm to help the older woman out. MIA followed, clutching her grandmother's hand as they walked into the station. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and unwelcoming. A board officer sat behind the front desk, barely looking up as the trio approached. Can I help you? He asked in a flat tone, his eyes scanning Evelyn briefly before settling back on his paperwork. Yes, Evelyn replied firmly, her voice steady but commanding. We're here to file a report about police misconduct. And I need to speak with the chief. The officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. Do you have an appointment? No, Evelyn said, leaning slightly forward, her voice sharper now. But I doubt the chief would appreciate me taking this directly to the mayor's office instead. Which would you prefer? The officer stiffened, glancing at Mrs. Betty and MIA before muttering something into his phone. After a tense few minutes, he waved them toward a seating area. The captain will be with you shortly. MIA sat close to her grandmother, her small fingers gripping the edge of her seat. Evelyn remained standing, her sharp gaze fixed on the hallway. She had no intention of letting anyone dismiss them or minimize what had happened. Eventually, a tall man with a weathered face and silver-streaked hair approached. His badge read Captain Walker, and his measured steps exuded authority. He stopped in front of them, his eyes flickering over the group. "I'm Captain Walker," he said, his tone guarded. "I understand you have a complaint." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just a complaint, Captain. It's an outrage. These officers attacked this elderly woman, destroyed their property, and confiscated money they were raising for medical bills." Captain Walker's brow furrowed as he looked at Mrs. Betty, who sat with a quiet dignity despite her frail state. "Is this true?" "Yes," Mrs. Betty said softly, her voice strained but steady. "I tried to explain to them, but they wouldn't listen. They pushed me, took the money we raised, and humiliated my granddaughter." MIA swallowed hard and spoke up, her voice trembling. "They ruined everything. We weren't doing anything wrong." Captain Walker sighed heavily, his expression unreadable. "These are serious accusations. We'll have to conduct an internal investigation." Evelyn took a step closer, her tone sharp. "I'm not interested in bureaucratic delays, Captain. What I want is immediate action. And I want those officers held accountable." Before Captain Walker could respond, the door opened, and several neighbors entered, led by Mrs. Green and Mr. Patel. "We're here to back them up," Mrs. Green said, her voice strong. "We saw what happened." The captain's expression hardened, realizing this wasn't going to be brushed aside. Evelyn crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "What happens next, Captain, will determine whether this station stands for justice or for abuse of power." The conference room at the police station was tense, filled with a silence so thick it seemed to echo louder than the words spoken earlier. Evelyn sat at one side of the table, her presence commanding even in the face of resistance. Beside her sat Mrs. Betty, holding Mia's hand tightly. The little girl's eyes darted around the room, wary of the officers who entered, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and defensiveness. Captain Walker took a seat at the head of the table. His weathered face betrayed the burden of his position as he opened the folder in front of him. "We've reviewed the initial complaints," he began, his tone measured but tinged with caution. "Officer Bradley and his team are here to provide their account." The door swung open again, and Officer Bradley entered, his posture rigid, his face set in a mask of irritation. He was flanked by two other officers, their gazes avoiding the family seated across from them. Bradley's eyes briefly flicked to Evelyn, and for a fleeting moment, his expression faltered. "Let's get this over with," Bradley muttered, sinking into his chair. Evelyn didn't wait for the captain's prompting. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Officer Bradley, we're here because your actions were not only unprofessional but outright cruel. I want to hear why you thought it was appropriate to shove an elderly woman and confiscate money from a child's bake sale." Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms. "We were responding to a complaint. They didn't have a permit. We were enforcing the rules." "Rules?" Evelyn shot back, her tone icy. "Since when do rules justify using force on a grandmother and destroying a child's effort to help her? You didn't enforce rules, you abused your authority." The room fell silent for a moment, tension crackling in the air. MIA shifted uncomfortably, gripping her grandmother's hand tighter. Bradley opened his mouth to retort, but Captain Walker raised a hand to stop him. "Officer Bradley," Walker said, his voice firm, This isn't the first time complaints have been filed against you for excessive actions. This time, there are witnesses. The captain gestured to the door, and Mrs. Green and Mr. Patel stepped in, followed by two more neighbors. Mrs. Green wasted no time. I saw the whole thing, she said, her voice steady with indignation. That little girl and her grandmother weren't bothering anyone. They were just trying to sell baked goods. But this officer, she pointed at Bradley, treated them like criminals. Mr. Patel nodded in agreement. I've known this family for years. They're kind, hard-working people. What happened was unjustifiable. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his bravado dimming as the neighbors detailed his actions. Evelyn seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior. And if you think this ends with an internal review, think again. We will pursue every avenue until justice is served. Captain Walker leaned back, his expression grim. Officer Bradley, until the investigation concludes, you're suspended. Bradley shot out of his chair. This is ridiculous. It's the law. Walker interrupted. And if you can't respect it, you have no place enforcing it. Evelyn met the captain's gaze. This is a step in the right direction. But I'll be following up closely to ensure accountability doesn't stop here. As the family left the station, the weight of what had just happened began to settle. MIA tugged on Evelyn's sleeve. Do you think they'll really do something? Evelyn knelt to her level, her voice firm but kind. Change takes time, MIA. But today, we made sure your voice was heard. And we won't stop until justice is done. Mrs. Betty placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, her gratitude evident despite the exhaustion in her eyes. You've done more for us than we could ever thank you for. Evelyn smiled softly. We're not done yet. She looked at MIA, her gaze filled with determination. And together, we're going to make sure this never happens again. The drive back to the neighborhood was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Evelyn glanced at MIA and Mrs. Betty in the rearview mirror. MIA stared out the window, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Mrs. Betty sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze distant. When they reached the small, weathered house, Evelyn helped Mrs. Betty inside, guiding her gently to the sofa. MIA followed, clutching the envelope containing the returned bake sale money. She placed it carefully on the coffee table, her hands lingering as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. Grandma, are you okay? MIA asked softly, kneeling beside her. Mrs. Betty nodded weakly, giving her granddaughter a small, tired smile. I'll be fine, baby. Don't you worry about me. Evelyn pulled a chair closer, her voice gentle but firm. You've both been through so much. But today was just the beginning. We're going to rebuild this, one step at a time. MIA looked up at her, her young face full of questions. But what if they don't change anything? What if they just forget about us? Evelyn leaned forward, meeting Mia's gaze. They won't forget. MIA. Because we're not going to let them. Your voice matters. What you did today, standing up and telling the truth, it's the first step in making sure they can't ignore what's right. MIA nodded slowly, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her shirt. I just wanted to help Grandma, she murmured. That's all. And you did. Evelyn said warmly. You showed more courage today than most adults. Don't ever forget that. Mrs. Betty reached out, resting her hand on Evelyn's arm. You've given us hope when we didn't have any left. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Evelyn shook her head. There's nothing to repay. What happened to you was wrong. And it's my responsibility to make sure justice is served. But more than that, I believe in you both. This bake sale was about more than money, it was about love, resilience, and fighting for each other. MIA sat up straighter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you think we can try again? The bake sale. I mean. Evelyn smiled. Absolutely. But this time, We'll do it even bigger and better. And I'll make sure no one can stop you. The idea sparked something in MIA. For the first time since the incident. She smiled, small, but genuine. Grandma, do you think people will still come? Mrs. Betty cupped Mia's face gently. They'll come, sweet girl. Because everyone sees what a light you are. As the evening deepened, the three of them began to plan. Evelyn brought out a notebook, jotting down ideas as MIA shared her vision for the next bake sale. Mrs. Betty chimed in occasionally, her weariness lifting slightly as the excitement grew. By the end of the night, the air in the small home was lighter, filled with hope and determination. It wasn't just about rebuilding what had been lost, it was about creating something stronger. Something that would endure. The next morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. Evelyn arrived early, carrying a large bag filled with supplies. Good morning, she greeted, her bright tone filling the small kitchen. Ready to get started? MIA and Mrs. Betty were seated at the table, their expressions more hopeful than they had been in days. Mrs. Betty still looked tired, but the spark in Mia's eyes was undeniable. I think so, MIA said, her voice tinged with excitement. Evelyn unpacked the bag, revealing vibrant tablecloths, colorful signs, and an assortment of baking supplies. We're going to make this bake sale the best this neighborhood has ever seen. Mia's face lit up. Really? You think we can? Evelyn nodded firmly. I know you can. And I'm here to help. The kitchen came alive with activity. MIA took the lead on the baking, her small hands expertly measuring and mixing ingredients. Mrs. Betty offered quiet guidance from her seat, occasionally reminiscing about old family recipes. Evelyn busied herself with preparing the banners and signs, her every action purposeful and precise. As the morning progressed, the sweet aroma of cookies, muffins, and pies filled the house. The energy was contagious, and even Mrs. Betty found herself laughing softly at Mia's enthusiastic chatter. Grandma, MIA said as she worked on a batch of chocolate chip cookies. Do you think people will remember what happened last time? Mrs. Betty paused, her expression thoughtful. People remember the bad, sweetheart, but they also remember the good. And this bake sale is about showing them the good in us. Evelyn nodded in agreement. Your bake sale isn't just about raising money, MIA. It's about showing the strength and love you both have. That's what people will remember. By midday, the front yard had been transformed. The new banners fluttered in the breeze, their bold letters reading, Mia's Bake Sale, made with love, supporting our community. Tables were arranged neatly, adorned with colorful tablecloths and trays of baked goods. Evelyn had even borrowed a folding canopy to provide shade, making the setup look professional and inviting. Neighbors began to arrive, drawn by the vibrant display and the delicious smell wafting through the street. Mrs. Green, who had witnessed the previous bake sale incident, was among the first to show up. This looks wonderful, MIA, she said warmly, purchasing a box of cookies. You've outdone yourself. MIA beamed, her confidence growing with every kind word. As more people arrived, the yard buzzed with chatter and laughter. Families stopped by with children in tow, and even a few strangers who had heard about the bake sale through word of mouth joined the crowd. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as MIA and Mrs. Betty greeted each customer. The bake sale was more than a success, it was a triumph. It was a testament to resilience and community. As the day wound down, MIA turned to Evelyn, her face glowing. I think we did it. Evelyn smiled. You didn't just do it, MIA. You proved to everyone what you're capable of. As the sun began to set, the once busy bake sale slowed to a gentle hum. The tables were now mostly empty, with only a few baked goods remaining. MIA sat down on the porch steps beside Evelyn, clutching a jar filled with money. She looked at it in awe, her small hands carefully tracing the edges of the glass. We raised so much, MIA whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I didn't think this many people would come." Evelyn smiled and draped an arm around her. "You underestimated the power of your own kindness and hard work. People notice when something is made with love." Mrs. Betty, seated on a chair nearby, observed the scene with quiet pride. She looked frailer than earlier, the day's excitement clearly taking a toll. But her expression was serene. "It's not just the money," she said softly. "It's what it means. All these people came because they care about us and because of you." MIA looked up at her grandmother, her chest swelling with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you and Evelyn." The three shared a moment of silence, basking in the glow of their collective victory. But the peace was soon interrupted by the arrival of a familiar car. The sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. Evelyn stood instinctively, her posture tensing as the door opened. Out stepped Captain Reed, the police officer who had stepped in after the bake sale incident. His expression was neutral, but his presence alone caused a ripple of unease through the group. He approached the porch, tipping his hat politely. "Good evening, Mrs. Betty." MIA. "Evelyn." Evelyn crossed her arms, her voice cool. "Captain Reed. What brings you here?" Reed cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "I wanted to follow up on the incident from last time. I've been reviewing the internal report, and I thought it was important to update you in person." Mrs. Betty gestured to a nearby chair. "Have a seat, Captain. We're listening." Reed hesitated but finally sat down. "First, I want to apologize again for what happened. It should never have escalated the way it did. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave, and further disciplinary action is being considered." MIA tightened her grip on the jar, her eyes narrowing. "Does that mean he won't do it to anyone else?" Reed's gaze softened as he looked at her. "That's the goal. MIA. We're working on making changes to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Evelyn stepped closer, her tone sharp. "Words are nice, Captain, but actions matter more. What steps are you actually taking to protect families like theirs?" Reed nodded, his face somber. "I understand your skepticism. We're implementing new training programs focused on community engagement and de-escalation. I also want to work with you all to rebuild trust." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then glanced at Mrs. Betty and MIA. "What do you think?" she asked. Mrs. Betty straightened, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We'll give you a chance, Captain. But we'll be watching." The next morning dawned crisp and bright, with the early sunlight casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Evelyn arrived at Mrs. Betty's house to find MIA already up, sorting through a fresh batch of supplies for their next bake sale. The success of the previous day had invigorated her, and the determination on her young face was unmistakable. "Look at you. Already hard at work," Evelyn said with a grin, setting her bag down on the kitchen counter. MIA glanced up and smiled, her eyes shining with excitement. "I want this one to be even bigger," she said. "We can help more people. Grandma says she's feeling better today, so she'll help too." Evelyn turned to Mrs. Betty, who sat at the kitchen table sipping a cup of tea. Her color looked better, and there was a newfound energy in her demeanor. "I'm not letting this old body stop me," she said with a small chuckle. "Mia's got big dreams, and I want to be part of them." As they planned the day, Evelyn noticed the subtle changes in both MIA and Mrs. Betty. The bake sale wasn't just an event, it had become a symbol of resilience and hope. The bond between the three of them grew stronger with each shared task, and Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Later that afternoon, the yard once again buzzed with activity. Neighbors who had attended the previous sale returned, some bringing friends and family to support the cause. This time, a local news station had caught wind of the story and sent a reporter to cover the event. Evelyn helped MIA answer questions with poise, guiding her through the unfamiliar territory of media attention. What inspired you to keep going after what happened? The reporter asked, holding a microphone toward MIA. MIA hesitated, glancing at Evelyn, who nodded encouragingly. I just wanted to help my grandma, MIA said. But then I realized we could do more. We can make things better for other families too. The reporter smiled, clearly moved. You're an inspiration to many. MIA. What do you hope to achieve with your bake sales? Mia's eyes lit up. I want everyone to know that even small things can make a big difference. And I want people to see that we're stronger together. As the day wore on, the sense of community grew palpable. Strangers became friends, and the atmosphere buzzed with positivity. Evelyn watched as MIA confidently interacted with customers, her shyness replaced by a blossoming self-assurance. When the sale finally ended, MIA counted the money with Evelyn and Mrs. Betty by her side. The total was even higher than before, a testament to their efforts and the support of those around them. This isn't just about the money anymore, Evelyn said, her voice filled with pride. It's about what you're building. MIA, a community that stands together. MIA looked at her grandmother, who smiled warmly. We did it together, she said. And I know Grandma is proud. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, they packed up the remaining supplies, their hearts full and their spirits high. The future felt brighter than ever. As the sun set on another successful day, Evelyn, MIA, and Mrs. Betty sat together on the porch, the warmth of their shared journey surrounding them. The once shattered confidence in MIA now gleamed brightly, a beacon of hope for their community. With every bake sale, they had proven that kindness and resilience could transform lives. This is just the beginning, Evelyn said, her voice steady with pride. You've inspired more people than you'll ever know. MIA. MIA smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without both of you. In that moment, they knew that their story wasn't just about overcoming obstacles, it was about creating a legacy of love, strength, and unity. Thank you for being part of this journey. If Mia's story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. Together, let's continue to spread hope and compassion.